Tenochtitlan, August 13th, 1521. A girl no older than 12 watches from the shore as Spanish soldiers drag her husband from a canoe. His name is Cuauhtémoc. He is the last emperor of the Aztec world. Her name is Teuikpo, which means cotton flower in Nahuatl, and she is the daughter of Moctezuma II, the man whose empire once held 25 million people across 400 tributary states. The soldiers force Cuauhtémoc to his knees in front of Hernán Cortés. The siege has lasted 93 days. 240,000 of her people are dead. The causeways that once connected the island city to the mainland are shattered and clogged with bodies. The lake water is red. Teuikpo has already been married 3 times. Her first husband was killed during the massacre of the Great Temple. Her second husband, her own uncle Cuitlahuac, died of smallpox after 80 days as emperor. Now her third husband kneels with a sword at his neck. She will never see him alive again. Within 5 years, Cortés will have Cuauhtémoc tortured and hanged from a ceiba tree in the jungles of Honduras. Teuikpo will be baptized, renamed Isabel, and married to 3 more men, all Spanish conquistadors she did not choose. She will bear a child by Hernán Cortés himself, a daughter she will refuse to acknowledge as her own for the rest of her life. She will become the wealthiest indigenous woman in all of New Spain, and she will die at 41, dictating a will that freed every slave she owned, a final act from a woman the empire tried to erase. She could smell the bodies decomposing in the canals. The August heat turned the lake into a cemetery. Flies covered everything. The priests who had served the Templo Mayor were dead or in chains. The warriors who had defended the causeways lay where they had fallen, unburied, because there was no one left to bury them. The women who emerged from the rubble carried infants too weak to cry. They had been eating leather and insects for weeks. Her story is the story of every Aztec noblewoman who survived the fall. The Spanish did not simply conquer Tenochtitlan. They built a machine designed to consume every surviving woman of noble blood and convert her body, her name, and her children into instruments of colonial power. This is dark history, and here we tell the stories your teachers skipped. If you believe these women deserve to be remembered, subscribe and leave a like, because what the Spanish built after the siege was worse than the siege itself. When Cortés first saw Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, his soldiers thought they were hallucinating. The city sat on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 raised causeways, each wide enough for 10 horses to ride side by side. 200,000 people lived within its borders. That made it larger than any city in Spain, and 5 times the population of London at the time. The central market at Tlatelolco hosted 60,000 traders every single day. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's own soldiers, later wrote that some of his companions who had been to Rome and Constantinople said they had never seen a marketplace so large or so well organized. Aztec noblewomen held protected roles within this world. They managed household economies, oversaw textile production that functioned as currency, and served as political intermediaries between allied city-states. Under Aztec customary law, a noblewoman could own property, initiate divorce, and inherit equally with male relatives. She could run a market stall, own slaves, and appear in court as a legal person in her own right. Her marriage was a diplomatic event negotiated between families over months. Her consent was not guaranteed, but her legal standing was. Aztec moral codes required strict standards of behavior from women, particularly regarding fidelity and household management, but in return, the law protected her property and her person. A husband who beat his wife could be publicly shamed and fined. The Spanish would strip all of these protections within a generation. The siege of Tenochtitlan was not a battle. It was an extermination campaign, fought with smallpox as much as steel. Cortés commanded between 800 and 900 Spanish soldiers, 80 horses, 16 artillery pieces, and 13 brigantines. he had built specifically to control the lake. His real army was indigenous. Up to 200,000 warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, and other city-states that despised Aztec rule joined the assault. The Tlaxcalans were so thorough in their revenge that even hardened Spanish veterans later testified they were disturbed by the scale of the killing. Men, women, children. The Tlaxcalans made no distinctions. By August 13th, the city was rubble. The Spanish demolished every building during the advance, filling the canals with debris so their cavalry could operate on solid ground. Smallpox had already killed much of the Aztec leadership before the final assault. Emperor Cuitlahuac died of it. Entire noble families were wiped out before a single Spanish soldier reached their doors. The survivors were mostly very young children and women. They emerged from the wreckage into a world that no longer had a name for what they were. Cuauhtémoc was 25 years old when he surrendered. Cortés kept him alive for a strategic reason. A dead emperor becomes a martyr around whom resistance can rally. A living emperor forced to kneel in public, submit to baptism, and watch his wife handed to a Spanish soldier is proof that resistance achieves nothing. Within weeks of the surrender, Cortés had Cuauhtémoc's feet burned with heated oil to force him to reveal where the remaining Aztec treasury was hidden. A nobleman, tortured alongside him, supposedly looked at the emperor in agony, and Cuauhtémoc reportedly replied that he, too, was not lying on a bed of roses. The treasure was never found. Some historians believe it was thrown into the lake during the final days of the siege. Others believe it never existed in the quantities the Spanish imagined. For 4 years, Cortés paraded the captive emperor through Mexico as a living symbol of Spanish dominance, dragging him on the disastrous Honduras expedition of 1525. During that jungle march, Cortés accused Cuauhtémoc of plotting rebellion, based on testimony from a single informant whose reliability was questioned even at the time. He had Cuauhtémoc hanged from a ceiba tree. The body was left for the jungle. The last Aztec emperor died far from the city he had defended, and his wife was already living under a Spanish name in a Spanish house, carrying a Spanish man's child. The conquest would not have happened without a woman. Her birth name may have been Malinali. The Spanish called her Dona Marina. History remembers her as La Malinche. She was born into a noble family, but sold into slavery as a child after her father died, so that her mother's new son could inherit. She was traded between groups multiple times, before ending up among 20 women given to Cortés as tribute by the defeated people of Tabasco in March of 1519. Cortés discovered that Malintzin spoke both Nahuatl and Chantalmaya. She became his translator, his advisor, and his concubine. She was so central to every negotiation that the Aztecs began calling Cortés himself Malintzin, as if he were an extension of her rather than the other way around. Moctezuma addressed all official correspondence to her. She bore Cortés a son named Martin, one of the first mestizo children in the Americas. When Cortés no longer needed her, he married her off to one of his officers during a campaign march. She was one of only 3 indigenous women ever granted an encomienda. She had helped build the system that would consume her people. During the chaos of La Noche Triste, the night of June 30th, 1520, when the Aztecs drove the Spanish from the city, and hundreds of conquistadors drowned in the canals, weighed down by stolen gold, Cortés made sure to take Moctezuma's daughters with him. 300 Tlaxcalan warriors and 30 Spanish soldiers were assigned specifically to guard the royal children. These were not refugees being protected. They were assets being secured. Teuikpo escaped during the fighting and rejoined her people inside the city. For over a year she lived as the wife of Cuauhtémoc while the Spanish regrouped and built their fleet. When the city fell, the Spanish recovered her immediately. Cortés understood something that would define colonial policy for 3 centuries. The daughters of conquered rulers were more valuable alive than dead. A noblewoman baptized, renamed, and married to a Spaniard transformed an act of conquest into an act of inheritance. The land, the labor, the tribute, all of it could flow through her bloodline into Spanish hands with the appearance of legal continuity. The Spanish did not steal the empire. They married into it. Bernal Diaz del Castillo described what happened to captured women after the city fell. When the Spanish attacked villages or cities, women were taken by soldiers as personal property. Diaz admitted feeling sorry when particularly brutal men mistreated some of them, but the admission itself reveals how routine the taking was. The women were distributed according to rank. Officers received noblewomen. Common soldiers received commoners. Cortés kept the most politically valuable women for himself, or assigned them strategically. The indigenous allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, also claimed women as spoils. The scale of the Spanish army at its peak, including thousands of indigenous warriors, meant that the number of women absorbed into the system after August 1521 was enormous, though no reliable count was ever made. The Spanish kept meticulous records of gold, tribute, and land grants. They did not count the women. The Encomienda system had been perfected in the Caribbean before it reached Mexico. Established on Hispaniola by Nicolas de Ovando in 1502, it granted conquistadors the legal right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities in exchange for their supposed protection and Christianization. In practice, it meant ownership of human beings without using the word slavery. The indigenous workers could not be sold on an auction block, which technically distinguished the system from chattel slavery. In every other respect, the distinction was meaningless. Encomenderos held, in the words of colonial legal scholars, practically absolute power over the people assigned to them. Cortés received the largest encomienda in the Valley of Mexico. 115,000 indigenous inhabitants fell under his direct control. He distributed smaller grants to his officers as rewards for service. In 1520, the Spanish crown had ordered Cortés not to establish encomiendas in Mexico. He ignored the order completely. By 1524, the entire Valley of Mexico was carved into grants, held by fewer than 300 Spanish men. The women within these grants were expected to fulfill all domestic duties demanded of them, every duty, without exception. Resistance was met with violence until resistance stopped. The system did not need chains. It had paperwork. The first thing the Spanish destroyed was their names. Teuikpo, cotton flower, became Isabel. Her sister became Leonor. Across New Spain, women who had carried names encoding their lineage, their birth date in the Aztec calendar, and their family's spiritual obligations received the names of Catholic saints chosen by friars who could not pronounce a single word of Nahuatl. The baptismal records in Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral, built on the exact foundations of the demolished Templo Mayor, list hundreds of these conversions. Each entry erases a genealogy that stretched back centuries. The evangelization campaign denied women access to every former custom. Under Aztec law, women could own property independently and initiate divorce. Under Spanish colonial law, a married woman's property belonged to her husband. The right to divorce vanished entirely. Catholic marriage was permanent, and its permanence served the colonial project perfectly. A noblewoman bound to a Spanish husband could never reclaim her former status, never return to her former gods, and never pass her indigenous legal rights to her children, uncorrupted by Spanish authority. The baptismal font was not a doorway to salvation. It was a legal mechanism that transferred ownership of everything a woman had, including herself. The Franciscan friars who administered these conversions baptized thousands in a single day, sometimes using a branch dipped in holy water to speed the process. They did not ask for consent. They did not explain the theology. They recorded the new Christian name, the date, and moved to the next person in line. An Aztec noblewoman who had spent her childhood learning the 260-day tonal Powali calendar, the rituals of the 13-day week, and the prayers to Tlazolteotl, the goddess who heard confessions of moral failure, found all of it replaced by a single ceremony performed in a language she did not speak. The old gods were not merely forbidden. Their temples were pulled apart stone by stone, and the stones were used to build churches on the same ground. Isabel Moctezuma was married 6 times. 3 husbands were Aztec, 3 were Spanish. She chose none of the Spanish ones. In 1526, Cortés arranged her marriage to Alonso de Grado, a conquistador who served as inspector of indigenous tribute. De Grado received Isabel and her Encomienda of Tacuba, the largest indigenous land grant in the Valley of Mexico, 8 kilometers west of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. De Grado died in 1528. After his death, Cortés did not arrange another marriage immediately. He took Isabel as his own concubine. She became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter, Leonor Cortés Moctezuma. When the pregnancy became difficult to conceal, Cortés quickly married Isabel to Pedro Gallego de Andrade, another soldier. Gallego died in 1531, barely a year later. Isabel was married again to Juan Cano de Saavedra in 1532. She remained with Cano until her death, but colonial court records show she fought legal battles for decades to maintain control over the Tacuba Encomienda, which multiple Spanish officials attempted to seize. The wealthiest indigenous woman in New Spain spent most of her adult life in court trying to keep what had always been hers. Aztec communities had already lost most of their men to war and epidemics by the time the Encomienda reached full operation. The men who survived were pulled from their villages to work mines, plantations, and construction projects. Women were left to perform all agricultural work themselves, planting, harvesting, and growing enough surplus to meet the tribute demands imposed on top of their own families' needs. The traditional division of labor collapsed in a single generation. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who had himself held an encomienda before renouncing it in horror, documented what he witnessed. He wrote to the King of Spain that women were forced to carry loads so heavy they suffered miscarriages on the roads. He recorded that some mothers chose to end the lives of their newborns to free them from the system they would inherit. He described the Spanish not as people who treated the indigenous like animals, but as people who treated them worse than the most abject refuse of the earth. Las Casas noted that the indigenous had never done the Spanish any injury, but rather reverenced them as persons descended from heaven, until they were compelled to fight back by repeated cruelties. Las Casas spent 50 years traveling between Spain and the colonies, making more than 14 Atlantic crossings, each taking 60 to 90 days to petition the crown for reform. His writings helped influence Pope Paul III's 1537 proclamation that indigenous people were fully human and could not legally be enslaved. But the cruelest irony of Las Casas's career was his early suggestion that African slaves be imported to replace indigenous workers, a recommendation he believed would save indigenous lives. He later repudiated this position completely, condemning all slavery without exception, but by then the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas was already in motion. The man who fought hardest for indigenous women had accidentally helped build the system that would enslave millions of Africans. The numbers tell the story that words cannot. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, the population of central Mexico was approximately 22 million. By 1600, it was under 3 million. On Hispaniola, where the Encomienda had been tested first, the Taino population fell from roughly 400,000 in 1492 to 60,000 by 1508, and to effectively zero within 50 years. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza killed millions. But the Encomienda turned survivors into forced laborers under conditions that accelerated death from malnutrition, exhaustion, and violence. The women who survived faced a specific form of demographic destruction. With most men dead or conscripted into distant labor, women became the sole economic unit of indigenous communities. Over generations, Young women left rural areas entirely to work as domestic servants or market vendors in colonial cities. By the 1600s, indigenous women were the majority of market vendors in cities across Latin America. They had not chosen this migration. The Encomienda had made their villages uninhabitable. The Spanish formalized their conquest into a racial classification system called the caste. At the top sat peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. Below them, criollos, people of pure Spanish blood born in the colonies. Below them, mestizos, children of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers. Below them, mulattoes. At the bottom, the indigenous and enslaved Africans. The system determined which jobs a person could hold, where they could live, what they could wear, and whom they could marry. A mestizo child of an indigenous noblewoman and a Spanish conquistador occupied a higher social position than his own mother. The child could own property under Spanish law. The mother, if she had not been baptized and married under Catholic rites, could not. The casta system meant that every child, an indigenous woman bore to a Spanish man, moved one generation further from her world, and one generation deeper into his. The conquest reproduced itself through the bodies of the women it consumed. Think about that for a moment. A system designed so that a woman's own children would belong to the civilization that destroyed hers, every generation diluted. Every generation further from the language, the calendar, the gods, the names. If you had been Teuikpo, standing on that shore watching your husband dragged from a canoe, could you have predicted that your own grandchildren would carry Spanish titles and speak no Nahuatl at all? Let me know in the comments. Cortés positioned himself as the protector of Moctezuma's surviving children. The legal framework he constructed gave him guardianship over their marriages, their property, and their bodies. He distributed Moctezuma's daughters to his most loyal officers, creating a network of alliances cemented by indigenous royal blood. Each marriage produced children who could claim both Spanish legal standing and Aztec ancestral rights to land and tribute. Cortés was not rewarding his soldiers. He was engineering a new ruling class that owed its existence to him and could not challenge his authority without undermining the legal basis of their own wealth. The daughters were the glue. Without them, the entire structure of colonial legitimacy in the Valley of Mexico would have rested on nothing but force, and force alone is expensive to maintain. His treatment of Isabel was the template. He kept her close, used her to legitimize his control over Teuikpo, fathered a child with her, then passed her to another man when her proximity became inconvenient. The daughter Leonor was raised in Cortés's household but given none of his titles. Isabel reportedly refused to recognize Leonor as her own for years. Colonial court documents record this silence without explanation. A child forced upon a woman by the man who destroyed her world is not a gift. Isabel's refusal to claim Leonor was the only form of resistance the system left her. In 1542, partly because of Las Casas's relentless petitioning, the Spanish crown issued the new laws. These attempted to phase out the Encomienda, prohibit new grants, and prevent existing ones from being inherited. The laws also ordered that all indigenous slaves be freed immediately. The response from the conquistadors was immediate and violent. In Peru, Gonzalo Pizarro launched an outright rebellion against the crown that lasted 4 years. He executed the viceroy sent to enforce the reforms. In Mexico, encomenderos bribed and threatened colonial officials until enforcement collapsed. The men who held encomiendas had no intention of releasing their labor supply on the orders of a king who had never set foot in the Americas and had no army capable of enforcing his decrees at such distance. The encomienda was replaced in theory by the repartimiento, where indigenous workers were allocated for fixed periods of forced labor rather than permanently. Workers were supposed to receive wages. They were supposed to work limited hours. None of these provisions were consistently enforced. In the silver mines, in the fields, the work was the same. The death rate was the same. The legal name changed. The bodies did not. In parts of Chile and the Yucatan, the Encomienda continued operating until the 1780s. It was not formally abolished until 1791, 269 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. The rescue never came. Colonial records use the phrase todas las obligaciones, all obligations, when describing what was expected of indigenous women assigned to Spanish households. Women who served as domestic workers were expected to fulfill every duty, demanded, domestic and otherwise, without limit and without recourse. Las Casas found the pattern identical everywhere he went. From Hispaniola to Cuba to Mexico to Guatemala, the same system produced the same results. The friar wrote that what he witnessed was not the behavior of men who treated the indigenous as beasts, which he said he cordially wished they would, but something beyond even that comparison. He described the nursing women of Hispaniola being worked so hard that their milk dried up and infants perished because their mothers had nothing left to give them. Indigenous women existed in a legal category that made protection impossible. They were technically free subjects of the crown, which meant the limited protections afforded to enslaved people did not apply. They could not be sold, but they could not leave. They were not property, but they controlled nothing, not their labor, not their movement, not their own bodies. A free woman with no freedom, a subject with no rights. The gap between not slave and free was where the system did its worst work, because in that gap there was no law, no advocate, and no witness with the power to intervene. The system had been designed this way. The gap was not an oversight. It was the architecture. Malintzin disappears from the historical record after 1529. Some sources place her death around 1527, which would make her no older than her mid-20s. She received an encomienda, and her daughter Maria Jaramillo inherited property and status. But in Mexico, Malintzin's name became a wound. The word malinchismo entered the language to mean betrayal of one's own people. Murals depict her as a serpent. Political cartoons use her image to accuse anyone of selling out to foreign powers. For 500 years, she has been called a traitor by the descendants of the civilization she helped destroy, as if a teenage girl sold into slavery and given to an army had ever been offered a choice. Scholars are only now beginning to reframe her as a survivor of impossible circumstances rather than a villain of national mythology. The reframing is slow, because the anger at what happened to Mexico still needs somewhere to land, and a dead woman cannot defend herself. Isabel Moctezuma spent her final decades in colonial courts. She petitioned the Spanish crown repeatedly for recognition of her rights to Teuikpo and for back payments of tribute she was owed. She won some battles and lost others. Her legal arguments were made in Spanish, through Spanish lawyers, citing Spanish law. The irony was complete. The daughter of the man who had ruled an empire of 25 million people had to beg a foreign court in a foreign language for permission to keep the land her family had held for generations before any Spaniard set foot in the Americas. She bore children by Juan Cano, and those children were raised as Spanish Catholics with Spanish names and Spanish legal standing. They spoke Spanish. They married Spaniards. The Nahuatl language of their mother's world lived in her alone. On December 9th, 1550, Isabel dictated her last will. She was 41 years old. She freed every slave she owned. She allocated 20% of her estate as a dowry for Leonor, the daughter by Cortez she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. She left personal items to her daughters by Cano. The will was witnessed by Spanish officials and recorded in colonial archives where it sat unread for centuries. It is the only document where Isabel's voice survives without a Spanish intermediary shaping her words. Isabel's descendants became European aristocrats. Through her children by Juan Cano, her bloodline entered the Spanish nobility. Her great-grandchildren held the title Count of Miraval, a title that still exists. By the 18th century, the family known as the Dukes of Moctezuma de Tultengo held estates in Spain and received an annual pension from the Mexican government, a payment that continued until 1934. The pension was based on the legal principle that Isabel's descendants were the rightful heirs to Moctezuma's throne, a throne the Spanish had destroyed. The irony was structural. Spain had built a legal system that recognized indigenous noble bloodlines specifically so it could absorb them, and 3 centuries later, that same recognition required Spain to pay rent on an empire it had stolen. The descendants of the girl who watched her husband dragged from a canoe in 1521 lived in Andalusian palaces and attended the Spanish royal court. They did not speak Nahuatl. They had never seen Tenochtitlan. They did not need to. The machine had done its work. Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral sits on the exact foundations of the Templo Mayor, the sacred center of the Aztec world. The stones of the demolished temple were used to build the cathedral's walls. Beneath the Zocalo, the main plaza that 20 million tourists visit each year, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of the original ceremonial complex. Visitors can look through glass panels and see the carved serpent heads that Cortés ordered destroyed 5 centuries ago. The Templo Mayor Museum displays offerings found in the rubble, jade masks, obsidian knives, the skulls of sacrificial victims. It does not display the stories of the women who survived the temple's destruction, only to be absorbed into a system that treated their survival as raw material. 8 kilometers west, the town of Teuikpo still exists. It was Isabel's Encomienda. Today, it is a crowded Mexico City neighborhood of apartment blocks, taco stands, and traffic. There is no marker, no plaque, no museum explaining that the wealthiest indigenous woman in colonial Mexico once held this land, or that she received it as compensation for everything the Spanish took from her. The neighborhood is called Teuikpo. The Nahuatl name was Tlacopan. Nobody calls it that anymore. Teuikpo was 11 or 12 years old when the Spanish pulled her husband from that canoe. She was 41 when she died, dictating a will in a language that was not hers, in a religion that was not hers, wearing clothes that were not hers, living in a city built on the bones of the one she was born in. In those 29 years, she was married 6 times, widowed 4 times, and made to bear a child by the man who destroyed her civilization. She was baptized, renamed, converted, and transferred between Spanish men like a deed to property, because that is exactly what she was. The Encomienda of Teuikpo was not a gift, it was a receipt. And she was one woman. Across New Spain, from 1521 to 1791, tens of thousands of indigenous women were absorbed into the same machine. Their names were replaced. Their gods were forbidden. Their children were classified by the percentage of Spanish blood in their veins. The population of central Mexico fell from 22 million to under 3 million in 80 years. The women who survived carried the genetic legacy of both civilizations, but only one culture was permitted to continue. Today, more than 60% of the Mexican population carries indigenous genetic markers. The blood remembers what the records erased. The Aztec poem, composed just 7 years after the fall, says it plainly. Our cries of grief rise up, and our tears rain down, for Tlatelolco is lost. The water has turned bitter. Our food is bitter. The anonymous poet wrote those words in Nahuatl, using the Spanish alphabet, because by 1528, the old writing system was already dying. The women of Tlatelolco put on the regalia of war and joined the final defense of the city. Their names were not recorded. Their fates were not documented. The poem survives. The poet does not. The women do not. Only the machine they were fed into left records. And those records call it civilization. If you want more history that others refuse to tell you, subscribe to Dark History. There are more buried truths waiting.